Good afternoon. Now, Mr. McBrearty.
Thank you, my Lord. My Lord, I was, of course, in the middle of submitting why it is that the ambiguities in the contract and tender documentation are somewhat academic when looked at in light of the parties' actions. And the second aspect of the parties' actions I'd asked your Lordship to take into account is the question of derogation requests. In my submission, it is notable that IHSL issued derogation requests seeking derogations from SHTM 0301 in relation to a decrease in air change rates in single bedrooms and en suites. Now, the detail of those derogations is dealt with at paragraph 64.15 of Mott MacDonald's written submissions. I don't intend to go through it in detail. But the important point I ask your Lordship to take account of is that these were requests to derogate from the requirements of SHTM 0301 in favour of what was already set out in the environmental matrix. Had the environmental matrix been a fixed brief which took precedence over SHTM 0301, then there would simply have been no need for these derogations. And viewed in that light, my submission, the derogations make plain that IHSL recognised that they required to comply with SHTM 0301, irrespective of what was contained in the environmental matrix. And in my submission, once that's appreciated and one looks at those derogations, it is impossible to reconcile them with any suggestion that the environmental matrix was a fixed brief to be followed come what may. Otherwise, there was simply no purpose to those derogations. The third matter in terms of the parties' actions that I brought to your Lordship's attention, and I can do so very briefly, is simply the fact that the environmental matrix formed part of the reviewable design process after financial close. In my submission, by definition, that which was to be reviewable plainly cannot have been part of a fixed brief. So the reviewable design element of this, the fact that the environmental matrix fell within that scope, is irreconcilable with that matrix having been a fixed brief. And once one takes into account in my submission all of those matters, it becomes clear that whatever ambiguities there may have been in the tender and contractual documentation, and however any such ambiguities might be resolved in a different forum, the parties themselves conducted themselves in a manner which was entirely consistent with the matrix being a document which IHSL and Wallace Whittle were to take responsibility for, and which was capable of being changed, and which was changed by them. And in so acting, in my submission, they acted in a manner which made plain that the responsibility for ensuring compliance with SHTM 0301 remained entirely with the private sector. And so to say that the ambiguities in the tender and contract documents lay at the heart of the problem which ensued, to use a phrase stealing from counsel to the inquiry submissions, has in my submission an air of unreality about it. Because quite frankly, it doesn't appear to have impacted upon parties' conduct. I would understand much better if we faced a situation where IHSL, Multiplex and Wallace Whittle were coming to the inquiry and saying, well, this documentation was all ambiguous. We didn't know what it meant, and that explains why we didn't make changes to the environmental matrix, and that explains why we didn't review it, because it was ambiguous and we didn't think it was our responsibility. But we can see that they did take on board, they rebranded it, they made changes, they made critical changes, they did review it. According to Mr. McKechnie, they reviewed it by reference to the guidance. So there is a disjunct in my submission between the ambiguities, which I acknowledge on the one hand, and the causal potency when one considers the problems that ensued. And in that respect, if I might just track back briefly back to Guidance Note 15 and the change made to that guidance and what in my submission it tells us. Because if we go all the way back to the beginning of the first form of the environmental matrix, we know that what was in place at that stage contained a discrepancy. We know that on the one hand there was a discrepancy between the values in the individual cells, which was incorrect, and the content of the guidance note, which was correct. And I don't think it's in doubt. We know that that error in the individual cells was simply human error. Your Lordships had the evidence of Michael O'Donnell. We know that in carrying out his initial review of the matrix, he did not notice that discrepancy. And his explanation was that comfort might have been taken from the content of the guidance note 15, because one could see that the guidance note was at least directing the reader to the correct interpretation of SHTM 0301. And that, respectfully, seems to me as an understandable, human error happens, that's sometimes happens, sometimes can be avoided. Mr. O'Donnell's explanation as to why it wasn't picked up in review is perhaps unfortunate, but understandable also. And the question then becomes, well, when could it or should it have been picked up? And it's in that context, in my submission, that Wallace-Whittle's review and changes to the guidance note are critical. And I say that because Wallace-Whittle were the party responsible for dealing with the ventilation design. As I've already indicated, on the basis of Mr. McKechnie's evidence, it appears that they were concerned with ensuring compliance with the guidance. They carried out a detailed check of the matrix. What was carried out does not appear to have been a spot check. It was a detailed review, the intended result of which was to ensure that the matrix met the requirements of the relevant guidance. And the result of that check was that the previous discrepancy between the values in the individual cells and the guidance note, which hadn't been picked up on prior to that, was resolved. The discrepancy disappears. But of course, it disappears by way of Wallace-Whittle having adopted, in my submission, what is plainly an erroneous interpretation of SHTM 0301. The interpretation adopted by Mr. McKechnie that the air change per hour for critical air care applied only to isolation cubicles is one which appears to only have been favoured by Mr. McKechnie. I don't intend to take your Lordship through. He has the submissions.
On a matter of tiny detail, the fact that Guidance Note 15 was changed, I suppose, is an indication that Mr. McKechnie's the view of the interpretation which he explained in his evidence was in fact his historical view, as opposed to something which has been come to in response to events.
I think that must be right. I mean, it plainly indicates that he changed it contemporaneously. We could see that by virtue of having changed Guidance Note 15, he must have applied his mind to the matter and what the proper interpretation was. That was his interpretation at the time. So that's the reason for it. It is, in my submission, an erroneous interpretation. I've noted in Wallace-Whittle's written submissions, for the purpose of this stage of the inquiry, it is presented as if the interpretation of the relevant part of SHTM 0301 is a matter of expert opinion on which there might be differing responsible interpretations of the guidance. And what's highlighted by Wallace-Whittle is the difference of opinion between Mr. McKechnie on one hand and Mr. Maddox on the other. But I simply make the point, it wasn't simply Mr. Maddox who disagreed with Mr. McKechnie's interpretation. Mr. Maddox's approach to it was really the entire premise upon which the opening of the hospital was delayed, and the remedial works were instructed was all because of a common understanding amongst those involved at the time that the entry in the guidance regarding critical areas was not limited to isolation rooms.
When it comes to the proper construction of SHTM 0301, is that really a matter of opinion?
I respectfully suggest it's not. Someone is perfectly entitled to express their opinion on it, but at the end of the day, it is simply a question of reading the clear words in the document. And of course, we're not in the territory here. Your Lordship's not in the territory here of determining civil rights and obligations as he would be if he were trying to determine the correct interpretation of the contract. It's the guidance and it's the heart of what your Lordship's looking at.
I accept that, but lawyers tend to approach documents on the basis that lawyers are at least as well equipped to understand documents as anybody else, unless special terms of art are used or would it be wrong of me to consider for myself what the document, what SHTM, and it really comes down to the table on a proper construction means?
No, I don't think it would be wrong of your Lordship to do that. I think it would be right. Your Lordship is looking at the words of the guidance himself. I think in the forum in which your Lordship's in, it would be perfectly reasonable in the same way as if your Lordship had been sitting in court and interpreting a contractual document, he might have regards to the factual matrix surrounding it. I think in this context, by analogy, it would be reasonable to listen to what those who are involved in the particular field, what their experience is, what they could, what light they could shed on it, whether there are any practical matters surrounding it which would make one interpretation of it more likely than another. And I think if your Lordship broadens it up out to look at it in that way, what he can see is that there's only one person contending for Mr. McKechnie's interpretation, and that's Mr. McKechnie. Mr. Maddox didn't support it. Those who were responsible for delaying the opening of the hospital didn't support it. Don't think any other core participant supports it. And that's all for a good reason. It's because it's not what it says. And it would really make the guidance devoid of meaning in a substantial respect if one were to take Mr. McKechnie's approach. And again, I don't mean this to be personally critical. This is not a witch hunt against Mr. McKechnie, but when it comes to my submission, it's an incorrect interpretation. And if I'm right about that, the importance is from that point on, from the point of his review, the error in the environmental matrix is no longer an inadvertent human error, which is what it was prior to that point in time. It was an inadvertent human error which might have been picked up, might not have been picked up. It becomes an error at that stage, which is as a result of a positive choice on the basis of an erroneous interpretation. Positive choice on the basis of an erroneous interpretation. I acknowledge, as I've said before, counsel to the inquiry submits that there's no reason to think the mistake was made other than in good faith. I don't take issue with that. But it was a positive error which led to the environmental matrix changing, so it no longer contained that inadvertent discrepancy and instead contained an error which came about as a result of plain mistake. And that error was compounded by the fact it was not highlighted. One can see within the relevant document that minor changes were highlighted, including, for example, the insertion of the word "the." It's difficult to see that there was a satisfactory explanation for the failure to highlight the change to guidance note 15. But again, I don't make a great deal of that. The simple fact of the matter is it should have been highlighted. It wasn't highlighted. It's entirely understandable that NHS Lothian and Mott MacDonald did not review a change that was not highlighted. And the result of that in my submission is that if the inquiry is concerned, as it should be, with missed opportunities, this is the missed opportunity because it was a critical change to the way in which the guidance was to be understood. And in my submission, it's reasonable to infer that had it been highlighted, it would have been picked up on, and that Mr. McKechnie's interpretation of the guidance would have been questioned. And it's reasonable to infer that that questioning would at least have led to a consideration of the values then expressed in the individual cells. I mean, we can't know that for sure, but given the difference of views that have been expressed about the interpretation, it is reasonable to infer that that would have triggered a review of the values. And so, when one looks at that change to Guidance Note 15 in my submission, that, rather than the ambiguities in the contract documentation, is at the heart of the problems. And I simply draw the threads to that together by making three key points, my lord. The first is one I've already made, but emphasise, even if the inquiry is to conclude that the tender and contractual documents were ambiguous, it's difficult to see that those ambiguities actually caused the difficulties which then arose. We know that the party with responsibility for ventilation design actively considered the environmental matrix with a view to assessing compliance. The environmental matrix thereby was not treated as a mandatory document to be blindly complied with, irrespective of what the guidance said. And we know that the discrepancy was resolved in favour of an erroneous interpretation. It's that critical issue which leads to the problem. The second point I make from Guidance Note 15 is that this was a genuinely missed opportunity to pick up on the problem. The whole purpose of Mr. McKechnie's review was to ascertain any difficulties with the environmental matrix. And on behalf of Mott MacDonald, I respectfully agree with what was said by NHS Lothian about the single point of failure, because it is difficult to see why it is that on the private sector side, responsible for design, why it is that the views of one person in relation to the interpretation of the guidance should not have been checked, cross-checked, highlighted in some way. And the third point I make, arising from Guidance Note 15, is simply this, that viewed in that light, the other possible occasions on which the problem with the environmental matrix might have been discovered are, I respectfully suggest, comparatively of far less significance. With hindsight, it can be said that the problem with the environmental matrix could have been or might have been picked up at certain stages. I'll come on to just say a little more about this at the review of tenders or the review of design at financial close, or when parties were considering a change in pressure to the 4-bedroom rooms. They're all occasions in which I acknowledge the problem might have been picked up. But to have picked up on the problem of those occasions would have been to pick up an issue which was not the principal focus at the point in time. And just to expand upon that just a little, if I may, my lord. They are all, and again, I don't shy away from it, these are occasions on which it's unfortunate that the problem wasn't picked up. It would have been better if it would have been picked up, but it's a could have rather than a should have, my submission. They can all be contrasted in my submission with the review by Wallace Whittle, the specific purpose of which was to consider the environmental matrix in detail and to assess whether it met the specific guidance. The other occasions in my submission are simply not in the same category, either partly because what was being undertaken was quite properly not a full audit of the environmental matrix, or partly because what was under review meant that the focus of discussion was not specifically ventilation. So if I might just take some examples of those other occasions, my lord, on which it might have been picked up, could have been picked up, but wasn't. The tender evaluation stage. what your lordship has heard is that, again, tracking back to what the proper role was of Mott MacDonald and NHS Lothian, they were not at the tender evaluation stage charged with the task of undertaking a full technical audit of the design. The design wasn't even fully developed by that stage, and what they were doing was going through the process of undertaking a tender evaluation process. Significant amount of material to get through, and understandably, consistent with the task that Mott MacDonald had, what they were doing was spot checks. Spot checks on the tender evaluation basis. It's described by counsel to the inquiry as having been a low intensity review. Now, if that's meant as a neutral description of it, I don't take issue with it. If it's intended to be a critical description of it, then I would take issue with it, because in my submission, the evidence that your lordship has heard is that spot checking of that nature at the tender evaluation stage is entirely consistent with what the proper approach was. And to have done otherwise would have been a huge amount of work at very considerable cost, inconsistent with the process that was undergone. So could it have been picked up? It could have been. Should it have been? In my submission, no. Similarly, during the reviewable design data process, Mott MacDonald, it is true, were carrying out checks of what was being presented to them.
Sorry, we're now talking about reviewable design.
Yes,
Yep.
to take another example of the stage at which it could have been noticed. Conform to the contract, Mott MacDonald were not confirming the changes as having been compliant with guidance. In effect, contractually, what they were simply doing was indicating that it was permissible for the changes to be used for the purpose for which they were intended. But it was not Mott MacDonald's job, nor NHS Lothian's job, to carry out a detailed review line by line and to confirm that what was proposed was compliant with the guidance. This may, I think, bears upon.
And again, I mean, you draw attention to this in your written closing statement, but just help me a little with the phrase "used for the purpose intended," which I appreciate is a contractual, or at least I think is a contractual provision. That is to be understood in the context of operational functionality. In other words, the people who are intending to use the hospital see that as a possible solution given the adjacencies, which, I mean, this is maybe a simplification, but when I'm thinking about operational functionality, I'm really thinking about adjacencies and not much else. I mean, have I got that correct?
That would be, I'll just check with Mr. Balfour. Yeah, that would be my understanding, and I'm pleased to see Mr. Balfour nodding his head and agreeing with me. I think we would share your lordship's understanding of that, and therefore that's the purpose of that review process. And one of the points that your lordship had asked for submissions on, I don't intend to go through that separate paper in detail, but was the point picked up by another core participant to the effect that it said that Mott MacDonald carried out very detailed scrutiny at that stage. Well, it's true that they did review it. It's also true that they did pick up on some matters which went beyond operational functionality, because no doubt if they're reviewing it and a matter jumps off the page to them and they pick up on something, well, they're going to highlight it. But the review was for the purposes of the reviewable design process. That was the limit of Mott MacDonald's responsibility. And it was not a review for the purposes of checking that all parameters in the design complied with the relevant guidance. So again, I make the point that just as with the tender evaluation, it's a could have picked up. It's not a should have picked up. And just to pick up the last example is, unsurprisingly, the whole issue about the 4-bedded rooms and the change in the pressure regime. And combined with that, then what flowed through to SA1, the settlement agreement. Of course, it's, I think, regrettable, everyone would recognise it's regrettable that it wasn't picked up, that some of those rooms were critical care, and therefore there was the issue of the air change that would have been applicable just as in relation to the ventilation. Could the ventilation issues have been noticed? Yes, undoubtedly. Is it understandable that they weren't noticed in the context of what was under discussion in my respectful submission? Also, yes, that's understandable. And there were different people involved at different meetings. The focus of the discussion changed. I mean, to draw one example, Mr. Henderson of NHS Lothian, who was someone who was involved throughout the whole of that process, I think, from recollection, involved at all of the key meetings. Someone who I think himself recognised that he had a good working knowledge of SHTM 031 and the requirements of it. And he's involved in a process, the focus of which is pressure change. And he didn't join the dots. And I simply make the point that in the context of an overall discussion about pressure changes, that's understandable. I'm not here to defend Mr. Henderson, of course, but that's understandable in that context, that air change wasn't to the fore. And unfortunate, but perhaps understandable that it wasn't picked up on. And all the more so then for Mott MacDonald, who weren't involved, or at least at some of the meetings, the critical meetings, we have those involved, and it's all detailed in the written submissions, but those involved weren't those with responsibility for ventilation. They had responsibility for project management or so on. And when it then comes to SA1, just to pick up on, and then this is again just picking up on one of the points which your Lordship requested further information on, and which we have dealt with in this separate paper, then yes, it's true, of course, that Mott MacDonald had technical input into the provision of the schedule, the technical schedule to SA1. And although the point I make is it was a collaborative process which came about, there was a resolution of the matter, and then there's a collaborative process to pull together technical schedule, and it appears that nobody has alighted upon the issue about the air change. I think what was your Lordship in his query picked up on the word I think used by NHS Lothian, which was that Mott MacDonald were implicated. You know, and I simply make the point which we've put in the paper, which is that it depends what one means by the word implicated. If implicated means that Mott MacDonald, along with others, as part of that process, were in the category of parties who could have noticed that the rooms involved were in critical care and therefore the air changes were inappropriate. Well, yes, accept that if that's what implicated is taken to mean. If it were, however, to be suggested that implicated means more than that, and somehow or other Mott MacDonald, and as part of that overall process, in which many others were involved, somehow or other they were in breach of contract or acted unreasonably by failing to spot the air change rates, well, that with respect wouldn't be submitted. But I draw out those and make those observations about those different stages of the could haves rather than the should haves. And the point I make about them, again, I just reiterate, is that in relation to all of those examples, either what was being undertaken was not a full audit. The purpose of it was not, the pointed purpose of the whole thing was not to review the environmental matrix having regard to the guidance. And on occasions, for example, the issue of the 4-bedded rooms, the focus of discussion was not ventilation. And so these are processes which arose in which they were occasions on which the problem might have been noticed, could have been noticed. But it wasn't the main focus. And that's why my submission is correct to contrast those occasions with the whole question of Wallace-Whittle's review. Should that have been noticed? Yes, absolutely, because it's not in the same category as the other occasions. The very purpose of it was the review of the environmental matrix from a ventilation perspective. So that really comes back to the question that I've raised and have sought to reiterate. That is the issue that has causal potency in the overall context here. I think that really is as much as I can usefully add. Your Lordship, I think, has had benefit of very full submissions from us in writing, which I'm very grateful to Mr. Balfour for bearing the burden of. They are in detail, much more detailed, I think, than others. Brevity is often held up as being a great virtue these days, my Lord. In providing the submissions that we have done, the purpose was, one, to give your Lordship a document which doesn't require him to go backwards and read what we've previously provided, so it's an all-encompassing document. And the effort has also been made to, when we're making statements, we've sought to provide your Lordship with the references and the evidence and the documents so that your Lordship is very clear about the basis upon which we submit it, whatever your Lordship makes of the submissions that come at the end of it. So I do appreciate it's been quite a long read, but I do hope that your Lordship gets value from it.
The answer is, well, yes to both your points. It's 125 pages, but I have benefited from reading it, and I suspect I will read it again.
Thank you.
Right.
I don't think I can be of any further assistance. Your Lordship has the document responding to the specific queries that he's raised. I'm very happy to deal with any of those if your Lordship wishes to me. I've touched upon probably what's the most important of those from Mott MacDonald's perspective.
No, I don't think so, Mr. McBrearty. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, the next core participant I would invite to address me is NSS. Now, have I detected a change of personnel or not?
Lord Bray, I think it might be Multiplex next.
Well, whoever is to address me on behalf of NSS, please come forward.
I'm perfectly happy to address your Lordship now. I think in terms of the scheduling, actually Multiplex is listed ahead of us.
You're absolutely right. I have misread the list. Hence your a quite understandable confusion. Let's stick to the list. My apologies, Mr. Ross. Mr. McKenzie, I beg your pardon as well. My apologies, Mr.
Not at all,
McKenzie.
Lord. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, my Lord. My Lord, what I propose to do is divide my submissions into three parts. The first will be to briefly emphasise what I say are the key points from Multiplex's written submissions. The second will be to respond to the particular matters raised by the Chair. And the third will be to deal with some fairly minor points of detail arising from the written closing statement of NHSL. My Lord, I think before I get into that, given that we've just heard from Mr. McBrearty, it may be of assistance to your Lordship if I just cut to the chase on what I took to be the two key things that he relies on in support of his position that whatever the ambiguities in the contractual documentation and the ITPD documentation, the environmental matrix came not to be treated by the parties as a fixed brief. And I think in that regard he relied on two things in particular. One was changes to the environmental matrix, and the other was derogations. Dealing first with changes to the environmental matrix, my lord, my position is that with the exception of the change to Guidance Note 15 made by Mr. McKechnie, that all material changes to the environmental matrix were instigated by the Health Board and Mott MacDonald. The detail on that, my lord, is set out in Multiplex's interim written submissions. That's from June 2023, at paragraphs 8.1.
Could you give me the page number again, Mr.
Certainly, my lord's paragraph number, it was 8.1 to 8.18, which I think your lordship should find on, well, it's internal page 29. I'm sorry, my lord, I don't have the reference in the combined bundle.
If you don't have the bundle reference, I'll just take the paragraph numbers.
I'm obliged. I'm sorry, my lord. It's just because I was.
Right.
Because I'm just
What I've got
responding.
is paragraph 6.1.
8.1, my lord. 8.1 to 8.18. And the key point I make at paragraph 8.17 of the written submissions is that the change to the environmental matrix on the 31st of October 2014 and the continued scrutiny thereafter was brought about by the Health Board and Mott MacDonald identifying a change they wished to make to the environmental matrix, not by development of the design on the part of IHSL, Multiplex or Wallace Whittle. Now, Guidance Note 15, the change to that, I think, is in a separate category, my lord, and I accept that.
Sorry, Mr. McKenzie, I'm being slow on this. Right. I have your...
sorry, my lord, the interim submissions are not in the closing bundle. The interim written submissions.
Okay.
These are the submissions from June 2023.
These are, okay. These are references to the closing statement after the
Correct.
2023 hearing. Right.
Correct. I'm sorry, my lord, I should have made that clear.
Right.
That's my fault.
I don't have that in front of me, but that's not necessarily a problem.
No.
So I may just... So the reference to paragraph 8.1 to 18 and 8.17 are to your first closing statement.
Correct. Yes.
Right.
I'm obliged. And as I say, that deals with changes other than the change to Guidance Note 15, which I accept is a missed opportunity.
Okay. And you use the word instigated. Now, I'll get an explanation for it once I've got your document in front of me, but just to give me a heads up, what do you mean by instigated?
Well, the change came from NHSL and Mott MacDonald rather than from development of the design on the part of the project company team.
Right. So, well, I'll look at the detail, but thinking about it at the moment, you say the changes other than the guidance notes were effectively adopting proposals or suggestions?
Responding to
responded.
to matters which had been raised by the client team, if I can put it that way, my lord. Turning to the derogations, similarly, my lord, the short point there is that those were asked for by the client team, but the evidence from Mr. Hall was that he didn't consider that they were required because he considered the brief to be a fixed brief. And so the request was on the part of the client team, it was understood to be something that they wanted. And it was something that the derogations were prepared in response to that request with a view to being helpful. But it wasn't because that the environmental matrix was not viewed as being as a fixed brief, and that therefore there was a derogation from SHTM 0301 that was required. And if I can just give my lord the reference number,
Yes.
the references for Mr. Hall's witness statement. Is this the witness statement of Mr. Hall for the purposes of the 2024 hearings? It's bundle 2 of the witness statement bundle. And it's paragraphs 45 to 56 of that statement.
'45 and 50,
45 to 56.
256.
Yeah.
Right. And I'll get an explanation there.
Yes, my lord.
Because as a point of argument, on at least first blush, it's quite a powerful point that Mr. McBrearty makes, because is it not? I think there are two derogation requests. And as I understand it, it's only the second one that is actually dealt with. Is it number 15 or number 16? But it's a totally pointless exercise to ask for a derogation from the environmental matrix if what you're asking for appears in the environmental matrix.
I believe the understanding of Mr. Hall was the obligation is to comply with the environmental matrix. And what was being sought on the client side was a paper trail to show that the environmental matrix, which is the fixed brief as we would have it, is something that is different from the requirement of SHTM 0301.
Sorry, different from?
From the requirement in SHTM 0301.
But, well, I'll look at, and certainly tell me anything else I should know, but, and I'll look at Mr. Hall's evidence. But as I say, on the face of it, it's an odd thing to do, to derogate from, I mean, the derogation was I don't see why Mr. Hall entertained this proposal, even if it was a proposal coming from NHSL.
Well,
he did.
he did,
Right,
I think,
okay.
in an attempt to be helpful, but not because it was considered to be necessary. So, my lord, that deals with those few points. That's the starting point. So I turn then to the first part of my submissions, and really I would like to emphasise the starting point from Multiplex's point of view, which is that in my submission the environmental matrix was very clearly the brief, at least at bid stage. And as I say in my closing statement, I invite your lordship to reject as improbable the contention that it was not. And that's for all the reasons I've set out in writing. Principally, the incompatibility with the idea that what NHSL wanted to do was to not waste the time and money that had been spent in establishing the reference design. They wanted to find a way to use that and not waste it. And the environmental was part of that work product. And I also rely on the wording of the ITP documents. I don't propose to go into that detail here and now. It's set out in writing. But, my lord, all of this came to be supported in my submission by the observations of Mr. Maddox. He saw no point in providing an environmental matrix that could not be relied on in the bid situation. And it was certainly Multiplex's understanding that the environmental matrix was the brief at bid stage. And my submission to the inquiry is that on the evidence, that understanding is fully justifiable from an objective point of view. IHSL was entitled to and did bid on the basis that the environmental matrix was the brief. And I say that that is the correct contextual starting point for everything that followed. The understanding that the environmental matrix was the brief was never lost. And indeed, it was reinforced during the RDD process and the particular discussions over the ventilation requirements for the multi-bed rooms. If the brief was simply to comply with guidance, my submission is that that is not in accordance with the Scottish Government policy document CEL 19/2010, mandatory point 7. On the evidence before the inquiry, guidance is not an alternative to ADB, Activity Database, in quality and value in its application as a tool for briefing, designing, and commissioning. That's primarily because guidance is general and open to interpretation. And also because it takes no account, guidance takes no account of the particular clinical requirements for a particular project, which can only be established by extensive dialogue with clinicians, as was done in this case for the reference design, including the environmental matrix.
Well, that might be right, but I suppose Multiplex just had to assume that that had happened because they were not involved at that stage. Or have I not followed your point?
I'm sorry, Muller, I'm sure the fault is mine
No, quite likely to be mine. You're talking about the reference design, part of which was the environmental matrix.
Yes.
We do understand that there was clinical input
Yes.
and there was the clinical output specification. Now, this is, if I've got my chronology correct, this is all before the prospective bidders were identified.
Yes, I think that's correct.
Right.
Lord. Yes. Yes. Sorry. I see. Yes.
Mm.
Yes. They. No, I take my Lord's point. Yes, I think the assumption would have been that that was done. I don't know. I can't
It might be a
recall.
perfectly reasonable assumption, but
I can't recall.
Multiplex, simply because when they became involved, would have to assume that.
Yes, indeed.
Right.
Indeed. I can't recall, frankly, whether there's any evidence that the extent of clinical involvement was known to bidders and made known to bidders. To what extent the history of the project up to that point was common knowledge, I'm afraid I can't recall off the top of my head. But the point I make simply is that I make this in the context of the issue that if the brief was not, if the environmental matrix was not the brief, what was? And if the answer to that question is the brief was simply, you have to comply with guidance, I say that's not good enough under reference to CEL 19-2010, because guidance is not an alternative to ADB in quality and value in its application as a tool for briefing, designing and commissioning, on the evidence that your Lordship has heard. And again,
And what about the evidence as to whether the environmental matrix was the equivalent?
well, I think that supports the point I'm seeking to make, my Lord.
Mm-hmm.
It makes sense that the environmental matrix would be the brief because it is a tool that captures all of the relevant information, or is intended to capture all of the relevant information, which one might otherwise have had to derive from room data sheets, which themselves would have been populated by the activity database. And so it's simply a more user-friendly way of presenting a very considerable quantity of data. And the point I make is you get that with the environmental matrix, but you don't get that if the brief is simply comply with guidance. And again, my Lord, I'm simply emphasising points that are set out in the written submission. So if I can give my Lord the reference, again, this is to the interim written submissions from June 2023. More detail on these matters is at paragraph 6.1 to 634 of the interim written submissions. But they are also touched upon at paragraph 4.5.3 of the closing statement. The multiplex closing statement, that is. The next point I wish to emphasise, my Lord, is that resolution of the dispute about ventilation in multi-bed rooms involved NHSL and Mott MacDonald giving specific consideration to ventilation in the critical care department, including making specific comment on air change rates in critical care bedrooms through the RDD process. And they specifically wanted a pressure regime that was different from that called for in SHTM 0301. And more details on those matters are to be found in the closing statement at paragraphs 4.5.8 to 4.5.15.
And the point that the point that you're making is summarised at 4.5.15, is it?
Yes, my lord, that's the end point.
Therefore,
The
sorry, Ms. McKenzie. Yeah.
sorry, the discussion of the evidence that takes us to that point is set out from paragraph 4.5.8 onwards. And the follow-up point, of course, my lord, is that the Health Board was prepared to raise legal proceedings in order to compel that result.
Correct me if I'm wrong about this. The legal proceedings proceed, or at least the draft summons proceeded on the basis that the SHTM 0301 in fact required for 4-bedded rooms the pressure regime that NHSL was arguing for. I mean, if I recollect correctly, the table setting out the air change rates does not have a line for 4-bedrooms.
Yes.
And there was a difference of view, that being the case, as to which of the other lines should be applied in the case of 4-bedrooms. And I think it is the case that, and tell me if I'm wrong about this, that NHSL summons is premised on the NHSL preferred interpretation of the table.
I'm trying to recall off the top of my head, my lord. But
Well, I mean, I can pick it up from the statements.
The recollection I have, and I stand to be corrected, is that the summons proceeded on the basis of an argument that the solution, the pressure solution that NHSL favoured, was compelled by good industry practice.
Oh, I think somebody makes that point. Yes,
I think that point is made in IHSL's
I think you're right
submissions.
about that. Yeah, thank you.
Obliged. And my lord, in the course of the inquiry, the point has come up. Why on earth would the Health Board ever have wanted a new hospital that did not comply with current guidance? Now, I say that that's something of a double-edged sword. The more obvious it should have been that compliance with guidance, including SHTM 0301, was the Health Board's overriding requirement, the more difficult it becomes to understand why the Health Board was prepared to take legal action to compel IHSL to design and construct ventilation in the critical care bedrooms in a way that it now considers was not compliant with SHTM 0301.
Well, risk of stating the obvious. It seems to have been overlooked that what was being proposed in relation to air change rates was not compliant. Have I got that right?
Yes, and the question I pose is why that should be the case if it was so obvious.
Right. Just to make sure that I've got your point here, Mr. McKenzie, insofar as the solution for 4-bedded rooms, which NHSL was seeking to impose through litigation, was contrary to, in relation to air changes, contrary to what was required by SHTM 0301. Given all that, the points that you take from that are, if this was obvious, why? Well, what are the points you take from that?
So, my lord, I'm really making the point under reference to the pressure regime, which the Health Board was seeking to compel, which was not consistent with SHTM 0301, rather than the air change rates.
Right.
And I'm just posing the observation. Really, it's no more than that. That if it was so obvious that the overriding requirement here was to comply with the guidance, how is it that that situation came about where they were prepared to sue in order to bring about a different result on pressure?
Right. So do you want me to classify that as an observation,
Yes, I think
as opposed to anything you're taking any further?
Yes, absolutely, Molly. Yes, the point just,
A rhetorical point.
a rhetorical point indeed.
Sorry for interrupting.
No, not at all. And the final point in this chapter of my submissions, my lord, is to emphasise the fact that the Health Board ultimately proceeded by way of a high value change notice to secure the provision of 10 air changes and positive pressure in critical care bedrooms is inconsistent with the idea that that is what the project agreement had always required.
And there's no element of parties just reserving their positions on that, but wanting to get ahead with a. I mean, what we're talking about is post July 2019.
Correct.
Understand that the mechanism that was used was a board change, in the in the project agreement. If you require a change, that's inconsistent with your position that that's what the contract always provided. But my question to you is it possible there was just some sort of pragmatic solution there with parties perhaps reserving their respective positions, or?
Well, Multiplex wasn't there.
Sorry?
Multiplex was not involved in that,
Right, okay.
in matters at that stage. For what it's worth, my reading of supplemental agreement 2, and I think one of the other core participants has made the point that that's sometimes been referred to inadvertently as settlement agreement 2, when it wasn't a settlement agreement.
Right.
And that-
Supplemental agreement.
A supplemental agreement, my lord, and I think that is perhaps more consistent, at least, with the idea that it wasn't about a reservation of position. It was the contractual mechanism chosen to allow the works to procure these changed works to be done. So, my lord, that concludes the first part. I turn now to the questions which came from your lordship. The first one is to do with the independent technical audit.
Yes.
We're invited to comment, my lord, but Multiplex is not the best placed of the core participants to comment on this issue. It's really one for the Health Board and Mott MacDonald, both of whom have commented on it, and perhaps the Scottish Government. From the Multiplex point of view, the technical solution ultimately agreed contractually in Settlement Agreement 1, which of course implemented a technical solution which had been agreed and implemented earlier in 2018, as has been discussed in submissions earlier on today by others. As I say, from the Multiplex point of view, that involved the Health Board clarifying exactly what it wanted on the basis of clinical input and with the technical advice of Mott MacDonald. And so an independent technical audit could only have been a truly helpful exercise if undertaken prior to the technical solution being confirmed and implemented in 2018. If a technical audit had been left just prior to the signing in 2019, it wouldn't have been much help, because by then the work had been done on the basis of the agreed solution.
I suppose, other than to put parties in a position in February 2019 that they were in July 2019.
Yes, it might have brought matters forward.
But the ventilation was in place.
Fundamentally, it was in place. We're asked about likely outcome if such an audit had been carried out, and that is obviously now a matter of speculation, which would, in my submission, depend heavily on the scope of the audit. With the benefit of hindsight, it might be tempting to conclude that an audit, if instructed, and if the audit had used SHTM 0301 rather than the project agreement as the baseline, it would have detected a discrepancy between the requirements of SHTM 0301 and the agreed technical solution. But that's with the benefit of hindsight. If one puts oneself back in March 2018 without the knowledge of subsequent events and the benefit of the focus which the work of the inquiry has brought to bear on matters generally, the most that can be said in my submission is that if an audit had been instructed, it may have detected a discrepancy between the agreed technical solution and the requirements of SHTM 0301. So I'll move on to the second question now, my lord. It's about the stage 2 high scribe. Now, as the inquiry will appreciate, Multiplex's position is that Settlement Agreement 1 changed parts of the brief in relation to critical care bedrooms, in relation to pressure regimes, and confirmed other parts of the brief in relation to air change rates. It seems logical that any change to the brief in a healthcare project with the potential to impact on infection control risks should trigger a fresh stage 2 high scribe question set. And on that basis, the changes in Settlement Agreement 1 perhaps ought to have triggered a fresh stage 2 high scribe. However, neither Multiplex nor IHSL were in control of the high scribe process. The high scribe process was led by the Health Board. Turning to the third question, my lord, the question of independent validation. There seems to be no reason in principle in my submission why an independent tester, such as the independent tester appointed pursuant to clause 15.1 of the project agreement, Arcadis, I can't see a reason in principle why such an independent tester couldn't also fulfill the independent validation role envisaged by the note at the beginning of Chapter 8 of SHTM 0301, provided that A, the independent tester is suitably qualified and trained to fulfill that independent validation role, and B, the terms of the appointment of the independent tester provide for the performance of that particular role. But I think the Health Board's position, if I understood my learned friend Mr. Barn earlier, was that independent validation from someone who's not the independent tester is what it calls for, and it's incumbent on the Health Board to put such independent validation in process. And on that basis, which I can see, it I think begs a question rather than answers a question. Now, the note at the beginning of Chapter 8 of SHTM 0301, it describes validation as a process of proving that the system is fit for purpose and achieves the operating performance originally specified. That's what validation is defined to be by the SHTM. So that begs the question of what performance was originally specified. And of course, that may in turn involve a question as to the extent to which compliance with SHTM 0301 is contractually required or not. And that in turn may also involve questions about what the proper interpretation of SHTM 0301 actually is. No,
As you picked, sorry,
sorry, Molly.
No, I mean, as you picked up, Ms. McKenzie, what I was interested, and this may be a wrong, a quite erroneous thought on my part, but, well, a starting position is, I suppose, if you call someone an independent tester, that suggests that he's an independent tester. But I wondered if that was right, because the independent tester has duties to the contractor, possibly even different duties to the special purposes vehicle, duties to the funders of the project, and duties to the health board. And I just wondered if someone who is within that interlocking relationship of duties is what is envisaged in SHTM 0301 as an independent, is it engineer or independent advice to the healthcare authority.
I can quite see that, my lord, and I think your lordship has the health board's position on that, which I wouldn't disagree with.
Right,
my lord.
Yeah.
So the point I would, the point I'm perhaps labouring in making, is that in the present case, the independent tester was satisfied that the ventilation systems as designed and installed met the contractual requirements. We know that because he signed it off. IOM, however, were instructed specifically to validate from SHTM 0301 as opposed to the contractual specification. Now, those are not my words, my lord. Those are the words of Mr. Henderson in his witness statement at paragraphs 59 and 72, and his email to IOM, which is at bundle 6, pages 162 to 163.
Could you give me the pages again?
Bundle 6, pages 162 to 163.
Thank you.
And that's no doubt why IOM detected that the performance of what had been designed and installed didn't match what they were expecting to see, because they had been instructed to validate from SHTM 0301 as opposed to the contractual specification. And so the point simply is this, my lord. It's not just because you have an independent validation, in this case, that the issue was discovered. It was because the independent validation was instructed from SHTM 0301. And so having an independent validator who is a different person from the independent tester is likely to be less decisive or important than what it is exactly that they are instructed to do. So turning to question 4, my lord, the question about the neutropenic patient ward, Lochranza ward. The understanding stated in the question is correct. Multiplex designed and constructed the ventilation system of Department C 1.4 Lochranza Ward to the specification in the reference design environmental matrix. As to the question about the proper interpretation of Table A1 neutropenic patient ward, this wasn't focused on in the expert reports or the oral evidence before the inquiry. But of course, what was brought out in the evidence before the inquiry was the scope for differing interpretations of the guidance, and in particular Table A1. And in these circumstances, it wouldn't really be of assistance to the inquiry for Multiplex to offer a non-specialist view of the proper interpretation. It may be of more assistance to hear from the specialist designers, Wallace Whittle, on that point. Turning to question 5 and the effects of Mr. McKechnie's views. I accept, as is set out in the written closing statement, that had it not been for Mr. McKechnie's interpretation of the relevant guidance, the inconsistency between environmental matrix and SHTMO 301 in relation to critical care could, I don't say necessarily would, I acknowledge that it could have been identified earlier. That is a possible outcome, having regard to the change to Guidance Note 15. And that's because had that change been in red text, it may have indicated to Mott MacDonald or the Health Board that a particular interpretation was being put on SHTMO 301, which they may have disagreed with. But it may not have done. We simply don't know. However, Multiplex does not accept that it was under any obligation to flag derogations from guidance as a matter of generality, and I'll deal with that in a little more detail when I come on to respond to question 6. Now, it's submitted that the proposition that any lack of a finalised document clearly setting out the technical requirements for ventilation at financial close, rather than being the root of the problems, had no causal connection to the delay in the opening of the hospital. Because of Mr. McKechnie's views, I submit that that proposition is unsound.
Right. Would you like to develop that?
Yes, indeed. In the first place, it's Multiplex's position that the environmental matrix did clearly set out the technical requirements for ventilation at financial close. That was certainly the understanding of Multiplex and Wallace Whittle and IHSL. And in the second place, one could equally say that if the environmental matrix had properly reflected what NHSL actually wanted, i.e. if it had required 10 air changes and 10 pascals of positive pressure in all critical care bedrooms, then Mr. McKechnie's particular interpretation of SHTMO 301 would never have mattered. And that's why the environmental matrix is causally connected to the delay in the opening of the hospital. And the causal connection between it being erroneous, the environmental matrix being erroneous from the outset and the delays in opening the hospital is not removed by the fact that Mr. McKechnie's views as to the interpretation of the guidance coincided with the requirements stipulated in the body of the environmental matrix.
Could you just repeat that, Ms. McKenzie, so I can get a note of just precisely what you've said?
The causal connection between the environmental matrix being erroneous from the outset, and which is what I contend for, and the delays in opening the hospital is not removed by the fact that Mr. McKechnie's views as to the interpretation of SHTM 0301 coincided with the requirements which were stipulated in the body of the environmental matrix. So the point is simply, if the environmental matrix had been correct from the outset in terms of reflecting what the health board wanted, Mr. McKechnie's views wouldn't have mattered, because what the contractor and the project company set out to deliver was the brief, was to meet the brief. Now, if the suggestion is that if the brief had simply been comply with guidance, then Mr. McKechnie's interpretation of SHTM 0301 in those circumstances, his interpretation of SHTM 0301 means that the same issue would have arisen, then that does appear to be a logical conclusion. I can see that. But as I've already submitted, the problem there would be that a brief comply with guidance would not be in accordance with the Scottish Government Policy CEL 19-2010, Mandatory Requirement 7. So I turn now to question 6, my Lord. So the Health Board's argument that IHSL was under a contractual obligation to identify and flag non-compliances with guidance is made under reference to paragraph 2.3k.
Sorry, give me that reference again.
Paragraph 2.3 brackets
2.3
A for kilo
A.
Of section 3 of schedule part 6 to the project agreement. That's the board's construction requirements. And it proceeds on the basis that IHSL was required to take into account the guidance and advice within SHFN 30 and High Scribe. A note in passing, my Lord, I think the reference to paragraph 2.3k is an error. 2.3K refers to something called HDL, whereas SHTM appears at paragraph 2.3H. I don't think anything turns on that, and I have done a careful check to make sure that there are not different versions of the document lurking around in the bundles, and as far as I can tell, there are not. So I think it's possibly just a typo.
Well, what I've got by way of note, dealing with the proposition that Multiplex should have had in place their own processes, is that paragraph 2.3, now, when you originally referred to it, you said K, but is the K bit that's wrong?
The K bit appears to be a misreference.
And it should be,
Well,
or might be.
it might be 2.3F,
Right.
which refers to SHFN. It might be 2.3D, which refers to high scribe. And for completeness, SHTM is at 2.3H.
Right. Thank you.
And just on this part, my lord, in case I've set off on the wrong footing, I'm dealing here with not with the contractor and Multiplex having to have their own processes in place. I'll come on to that in just a moment. I'm dealing here with the obligation, the alleged obligation, to identify and flag non-compliances with guidance.
Right. This is the flagging non-compliance with a contract.
Yes, I'm sorry, my lord, I should have made that clear from the outset. So really all I've been saying is that the reference, the contractual argument is made under reference to Section 3 of the BCRs. And the point I want to make to your lordship is that paragraph 2.3 of Section 3 of Schedule 6, the BCRs, is the bit that commences with the following. Your lordship has heard this phrase a number of times and will have read it a number of times, I'm sure. In addition to the standards listed in paragraph 2.4 of this subsection C of the board's construction requirements, unless the board has expressed elsewhere in the board's construction requirements a specific and different requirement, the facilities shall comply with but not be limited to the provisions of the NHS requirements. And so the very section upon which NHSL's contractual argument relies is that part of the contract that IHSL and Multiplex rely on to say that all of that's fine unless the board has expressed elsewhere in the board's construction requirements a specific and different requirement. And of course our submission is that they did through the environmental matrix. I don't propose to rehearse all of that again. And so it's not accepted that there was any sort of contractual obligation such as is contended for by the Health Board at paragraph 25 of its closing submissions. The obligation contended for, which is to take into account the guidance and advice simply doesn't reflect the actual wording of the clause. And the clause, as I've just said, is subject to the board expressing elsewhere a specific and different requirement, which, for all the reasons set out in writing, it had done. And so for your Lordship's purposes today, it's perhaps sufficient simply to note that the obligation for which NHSL contend is highly controversial, without needing to decide the matter. But leaving aside the specifics of the contractual argument, it's also suggested by the Health Board, and this is at paragraph 24 of their closing submissions, on the basis of the evidence of both Mr. McKechnie and Mr. Pike, that any non-compliances with guidance should have been flagged, regardless of contractual significance. But, and to be fair, this is acknowledged by the Health Board, both Mr. McKechnie and Mr. Pike proceeded on the basis that they would have to raise items which were seen as non-compliant to guidance. And so the Health Board concludes that the only reason this didn't happen was because of Mr. McKechnie's particular view of the interpretation of SHTM 0301. And that is acknowledged. But the evidence of Mr. McKechnie and Mr. Pike provides no support for an argument that things ought to have been raised which were not seen as non-compliant to guidance. I mean, that would be absurd.
Sorry, just give me that again, Ms. McKenzie. The evidence of Ms. McKechnie and Mr. Pike does not...
It doesn't provide support for an argument that things ought to have been raised as non-compliant with guidance if they were not recognised as being non-compliant with guidance.
Right, I think I get that. Sorry, I'm just wondering if I'm following your line here. You point to the evidence of Pike and McKechnie as saying they could only draw attention to what they saw as non-compliant.
Yes.
Now, you then remind me that NHSL argue this didn't happen only because of Mr. McKechnie's particular interpretation of
Yes.
SHTM 0301.
Which meant it was something that wasn't recognised.
Sorry?
Which meant that it was something which wasn't recognised.
Yes, right. So where do you take me on this?
Well, simply, I agree with that point insofar as it goes. And I'm simply saying the obligation that's contended for is a much wider obligation
Yes,
to carry out a check,
Mm-hmm.
which would detect things which are not compliant.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm saying, no, that's not right. Not on the basis of Mr. McKechnie and Mr. Pike.
Mm-hmm.
It's simply a point that the evidence doesn't support a wider obligation, the wider obligation that's being contended for.
Right.
If I've understood that obligation correctly.
Mm. Yeah, and I'm just anxious to get the full benefit of your argument here, Mr. McKenzie.
I appreciate it's slightly tortuous, my lord, but I think that's because I don't. the extent of the obligation that is being contended for on a non-contractual basis now, it must be recalled, is quite difficult to get one's head round. And I suppose what I'm saying is that as a matter of logic, it can't be any more than the raising of things which are recognised.
Have an obligation to, as a matter of logic, you can only have an obligation to draw attention to something that you think is worth drawing attention to.
Indeed. Yeah, you can't have an obligation to raise unknown unknowns.
Right, okay. And that's the point. I mean, have I captured your, your point?
I'm slightly lost myself now. Yes, I think.
Right, okay.
The next point I wish to make, my lord, is the reliance on the point that Mr. McKechnie's interpretation of the guidance was an outlier, and that no other witness who was asked suggested that Mr. McKechnie's interpretation was untenable. The simple point I wish...
Sorry, suggests that Mr. McKechnie's interpretation was...
was tenable.
Tenable.
Not untenable. The point I make here is that that position has only emerged as a result of the inquiry. There was no witness evidence available in the period between 2014 and 2018 suggesting that Mr. McKechnie's interpretation was an outlier. And the short point I make is that the outlier point should be left out of account when one is considering and assessing what occurred at the time.
Well, can we maybe just tease that out a bit? I mean, starting with the evidence the inquiry heard as to how one should interpret Table A1. I think it is the case that Mr. McKechnie is the only person who has supported his particular, well, this is a bit tautologous here, but Mr. McKechnie is the only person who's supported a particular interpretation. In other words, the requirement was limited to the 10 air changes and the 10 pascals was limited to the isolation rooms in critical care. Now, the inquiry has heard that this is Mr. McKechnie's reading, as I observed, I think to Mr. McBrearty, the fact that he changed GN15 means that that's what he thought at the time, as opposed to just an argument that's been produced for the benefit of the inquiry. Now, I haven't heard anyone supporting that interpretation. So why should I not, and yes, why should I not regard that as, and in fact, this may be too generous an expression, an outlier interpretation of the provision.
My point,
even if no one was aware of what was going on between 2014 and 2018.
My point is simply that the inquiry now has the information to recognise that interpretation as an outlier, but the same wasn't available previously. And so it's really just a point about hindsight, my lord, where it's easy to sit here with the benefit of all the heat and light that's been generated by the inquiry and the expert evidence about the meaning of it, of SHTMO 301, and say, well, Mr. McKechnie's view was, way off to one side, an outlier. But nobody was, there was no such body of evidence available at the time. And so the clarity which the inquiry is able to look at things with now didn't exist at the time. That's the only point I'm making.
What is your response to the point that I made to Mr. McBrearty that lawyers think they can understand what documents mean, and because of professional prejudice, I might come to the, and if it's an arrogant view, I apologize, that I can interpret what's a proper construction of, I think comes to the table written in context with the other provisions. Am I entitled to come to my construction of the document?
So in my submission, yes, my lord, but because your lordship's heard evidence and has competing views on the meaning, and so has a range of views on the meaning of it, in the absence of any expert input on it, I would have been making a submission which would have been to the effect that your lordship should be very slow to reach a view on the interpretation of this piece of design guidance. And that's because it does appear to be open to a range of interpretations. And indeed, I think from the document that was circulated at lunchtime, Mott MacDonald's responses to the questions that your lordship had posed, comparing that with the submissions made by Mr. Gillespie this morning on behalf of, Mr. Barn on behalf of NHSL, it would appear that there's a difference between those two parties on the interpretation of the neutropenic ward element of the guidance. So that's a good example of where, we didn't hear any expert evidence really in relation to that aspect of the guidance, and two parties have come up with two different interpretations of that. So I would have encouraged your lordship to be quite slow to reach a view on the meaning. But of course, in relation to the critical care ventilation, your lordship does have the benefit of all of the expert evidence heard from Mr. Maddox and others. Also has the benefit of Wallace Whittle's discussion of that evidence and submissions made in support of the view that Mr. McKechnie had. And so I accept it as a view on the evidence your lordship's able to properly reach a view.
Would you agree as a matter of general, general principle that documents are capable of construction really just on the face of the document? It seems to me a task that lawyers carry out all the time.
They do, my lord. I'd fall back to the example given by my learned friend Mr. McBrearty about a court requiring to construe a contract. Sometimes that can be done on the documents. Sometimes it's helpful to hear the matrix of fact that lies in the background. So I would say it's not a one size fits all. It depends.
Thank you.
Thank you, my lord. I move now to the argument that IHSL and Multiplex should have had in place their own processes for design review and audit. This wasn't covered in any detail with any of the witnesses in oral evidence. And the suggestion raises a number of important but unexplored issues, such as the additional cost and the additional time that would be associated with something like that, which in turn would feed into the question of proportionality. And there would also be a question of effectiveness. if there was a requirement of this nature, it would apply not only in relation to the design of ventilation and critical care, but to the design of the entire hospital. A design review or audit for general compliance with guidance across every facet of a major hospital would be a fairly major undertaking. And I think Mr. McBrearty made some fairly similar points on the other side of the table when dealing with the question about whether a technical audit at the time of SA1 or the earlier technical agreement on the technical solution would have been necessary. And I think he raised many of the same kind of issues in answering that question in the negative. So my submission is simply that there's no proper basis for the inquiry to conclude that IHSL and Multiplex ought to have had in place their own processes for a design review or audit of the nature contended for. So, my Lord, that's all I wish to say on question 6.
Thank you.
Question 7 is not one for Multiplex. Question 8 invites comments in relation to the 2022 interim revision of SHTM. Multiplex isn't best placed to comment on these matters. Obviously, the 2022 revision of SHTM 0301 makes a considerable number of changes from the 2014 version, but whether they go far enough or whether there are any drafting weaknesses or deficiencies which would merit further investigation or further revision is better left to those with a focused specialism on ventilation design. Question 9. Core participants are invited to confirm the understanding which is stated there. And so far as Multiplex is concerned, the understanding is correct. Multiplex agrees with all of the potential recommendations suggested by Council to the inquiry. Question 10. Multiplex takes no issue with Council to the inquiry's assessment of the arrangements put in place by NHSS Assure. Now, my Lord, I'm conscious of the time. I'm also conscious that there has been a request for core participants to put in writing what they've been saying in their oral submissions.
Well, can I just clarify that? It's not a request to put in writing and one council has drawn attention to the fact that they have not put their closing submission in writing, but they will deliver it at an appropriate speed. Now, if I may say so, whereas obviously I would welcome any help. Your speed of delivery, Mr. McKenzie, is such that I think I've been able to note what you've said. Therefore, don't feel under any obligation to produce a document that you hadn't previously prepared.
I'm
On
obliged.
the other hand, if you want to give me a previously prepared speaking note, I'd be happy to have it.
I'll find some way of providing something which I hope will be of some assistance.
Well, I'd be happy to have it, but don't feel under any obligation to do so. I mean, given your speed of delivery in relation to the topics you've been dealing with.
I'm obliged, my lord. I was going to come on to the final part of my submissions, which is simply to pick up on a couple of points of fairly minor detail coming out of the closing submissions for the Health Board. Conscious of the time, I can do that in writing if that would be of assistance, or I can endeavour to deal with them now fairly quickly.
Well,
Or indeed work.
I think my only consideration is that what I sometimes forget is that there is a whole organisation here that has
Indeed.
been at their desks for considerably longer than I have. And if it suits you, Mr. McKenzie, with repeating my apologies to Mr. Ross, I think I would invite you to conclude tomorrow if that suits. I rather think as if we're looking as we probably will finish tomorrow. But unless anyone wants to draw to my attention any reason not to do so, if you're not going to finish by 4 or would feel under pressure to finish by 4, I think we'll adjourn until tomorrow.
I think, my lord, I've probably got about 15 minutes to go, so.
I think we might just break
do it.
there again,
Okay,
if that's suitable. Right. Well, thank you very much. I hope to see you all again tomorrow at 10 to resume with Mr. McKenzie and then proceed in the previously indicated order. Thank you.